Methods in linguistic anthropological research. So when we start to think about the methods that are used in linguistic anthropological research, the first thing I want to really have you think about is what is known as the ethnography of speech. So the ethnography of speech is a fairly qualitative method that approaches different kinds of research problems from a holistic perspective, from a variety of different angles and perspectives, with active participation and observation in that which we are researching. So it's a very naturalistic approach to individuals, their social and community relationships, and the way of life generally. It differs from ethnography in cultural anthropology by its attention to meaning and communication, and thus requires kind of a different set of data. So the ethnography of speech is the study of living language between people in a natural setting. This is the dominant methodological approach in linguistic anthropology today. If we think about the way that ethnography provides a certain kind of focus for linguistic anthropological research, there is a schema for how we understand language in this approach. So you can see this depicted here with sort of language or speech, a statement, particular words, let's say, that are at the center, and you can see these concentric circles outwards to things like the participants and the relationships. So there is individuals that are communicating around those words. And so the ethnography of speech really gives us the schema or model for the data that we're going to collect. So that there's going to be a kind of model where language is at the center, and these concentric circles outwards, you have the participants and their relationships to one another, the people that are using this language, that are using this speech, that are using these words. You have the broader activities and actions that they're engaged with. What is it that they're actually doing in their life? And this is situated more broadly in a context. We can call that a cultural context, right? A particular way of life. So ethnography of speech then is a big approach. It's a methodological approach rather than a distinctive method. And so to get at that schema, to get at that model, right? To reconstruct this language use in context, if you will, there are a lot of different methods that we will use. And so at the core of it, right, is language, and so there's going to be language study that plays a distinctive and important role in linguistic anthropology. This is a lifelong endeavor where you're always continuing to learn about the language. There's fieldwork, of course, that is getting out into those context, real-world context in which language is being used. So in addition to fieldwork, there's a lot of observation, the kind of fly-on-the-wall observation, as well as participant observation, where we're actually getting involved in that which we are researching. There is interviewing, and interviewing can be anything from structured, semi-structured, and unstructured. So structured would be that there's a fixed set of questions that one is interested in asking, such as a interview questionnaire. May have a dozen questions, and the interview is going to follow those questions closely, to semi-structured, where you may have the dozen questions and you may improvise new questions while you're doing the interview as relevant information is coming up. Unstructured interviews are hard to discern, let's say, from others than the anthropologist, that there's even an interview ongoing, because it could be a very improvised conversation that off the cuff questions are sort of introduced in the context of the conversation. This is fairly common when we are doing field work and we're talking with people, it may not be the kind of formal interview where we set up a questionnaire and we set up a time to meet with participants and so on. This may be very spur of the moment, just as we're interacting with people. Maybe we're doing participant observation and so on. And we then also add questions that elicit the relevant information relevant for our research questions. Of course, archival and textual research is also very important when we're doing research in linguistic anthropology. So in broadening our understanding of the context, right, from the language to the participants themselves, how they understand any one particular scenario, that in researching the context, too, we're going to go beyond those participants to look at archival data, to look at other kinds of textual research. And that can be in conjunction with research participants or just from the broader context as a whole. We may use things like photography and video for the visual data that is relevant for our research study, particularly from many of the nonverbal forms of communication, spatial relationships, and so on. Photography and video are also very good forms of note-taking as well, supplementing the general forms of note-taking that we do throughout a period of research. Field notes, as they're called. So the data that we collect then, we have a schema, the ethnography of speech. So we're focused on living language, and we're focused on language in its socio and cultural context. And so eliciting interviews, doing observations, doing archival research leads to something that we call the ethnographic record. This is the database that we compile all of this data, all of this information to be used in the period of analysis. When data collection is finished, right, then we analyze the data to see what it says of the research questions that we have. So it can be a very complex ethnographic record of your field notes, the photographs, those recordings, and so on. It can have recordings from naturalistic settings, things like maybe a meeting. Let's say if we were doing work in the context of the finance industry and banks and so on, you could imagine meetings that were permission was granted and naturalistic recordings of them were done. You can imagine the interview recordings themselves. You could imagine all of the different kind of archival and textual research, paper and digital documents, which today we would all scan into really a digital database. And there's different kinds of digital database software that anthropologists use. I've used DevonThink as one example of this kind of databasing software. So the data themselves, right, are going to, as we said, be the field notes, the recordings of natural speech, recordings of performances, something like, let's say, a speech that is given to a group where there's an audience, right, those kinds of performative recordings, recordings of interviews, archival records, and then transcriptions of recordings. This ultimately becomes the set of information that we use to answer our research questions, the set of data that we were not able to find, right, in that literature review when we proposed our research question. We said there is this gap, this hole in the literature, hole in our understanding. And so it's this data precisely that its analysis leads to filling in that hole, filling in that gap, answering that unanswered research question. Some of the data can be documents, and, well, it's usually a form of writing. There are some exceptions, let's say Quipu in South America, where it's a very distinctive information keeping record with rope, with its fiber based, and so in that sense it's not a form of writing, but we could think of it maybe as a document in this sense. So these are difficult to define in a way. It's originally a paper based text, kind of cross culturally, and found in physical and digital archives. And it's important. It can represent speech, Even like something like a diary can be an internal monologue the person's having. It can be something that's representing some kind of factual information. It can tell us about the participants, let's say, or the culture more broadly. And documentary evidence is very important in the ethnographic record. If we're thinking about documents, there's things that it contains, the information that it reports. It can also be what people make of that document, what users, what participants, and so on may understand it to be. It may even challenge what it is actually stating to represent or purporting to represent, to contain, let's say. And so sometimes we'll bring documents into interaction with participants in interview settings and so on. We will try to understand also not only what it contains, again, back to what it reports, but what it may omit, what it may not contain, and so on. Sometimes what is left out becomes very important. And we look at generally the structures, right, of documents that we collect in research. We can catalog them, right, by type, let's say, diaries, receipts, policy documents, affidavits, and so on. Understanding the kind of general structure of documents is useful for thinking about their place in the ethnographic record, in the same way that we were talking about, let's say, interview transcripts, right, and recordings of performances and so on. That when we're dealing with archival data itself is too general of a term. And so thinking about the structure of documents can be useful for how we incorporate them in an ethnographic record. And then the issue of ethics, very, very important when we're doing research, that the activity of the research and the behavior of the researcher is important. It's as important as any data, evidence, and knowledge that we produce. That is, our relationship with our research subjects is central to doing research. We need to be able to think critically about what we're doing and use ethical reasoning. That is, considering, is our approach good? Is our approach right? Is our approach moral? Does it follow professional ethics? Does it follow the ethics of the research participants, the people that we are working with, to make sure that our research is conducted in a way that is justifiable in terms of those kinds of ethical systems. Some of the basic principles you think about our own professional ethics, things like informed consent, always getting permission from the people that we work with, making sure that they agree. No data is so important that the consent of our research participants does not matter, that we do no harm, that through the process of research that we do not harm anybody, right? This is a major ethical impetus for anthropologists. Our research subjects potentially harmed by the research that we are doing, by our process of research, and so on. And then recognizing the kind of competing ethical obligations, so that while it seems simple and face value, research process always leads to the researcher finding themselves in situations in which often you have to compromise between one or other of your ethical values. So in conclusion, I've been thinking a little bit about methods in linguistic anthropology, and this kind of idea of an ethnography of speech, living language at the heart of doing linguistic anthropology today. And so we use many ethnographic methods that you may be familiar with from cultural anthropology. We talked about some of the process of field work, interviewing, and we concluded with thinking about the role of ethics.